Hi, I'm Ellie and welcome back to my Geography NEA support series. In this video, we are starting writing your NEA. You might have already collected fieldwork and you might be at the stage of writing up your geography report now, or you might be doing this before you've collected fieldwork. So in this video, I'm going to talk you through the following. 1, what do you need to include in your introduction? 2, how to write the literature review and my top tips for academic writing. 3, I'm going to talk you through a worked example. So I've literally written my own NEA. I'm going to talk you through how I linked it to geographical articles and academic writing, and also how I cut down the word count. And then finally, we're going to look back at the mark scheme to check we've included all the right things that are going to score us the highest marks. So what do you need to include in your introduction? The introduction is the first thing your teachers or the examiner reads. It should clearly set out your investigation. So you need to include the following: your title, so what are you researching? Your aims and your hypotheses, so what are your 3 either sub-questions or testable hypotheses or a mixture of the 2, and your link to the specification. So which part of the specification does it clearly link to? All these 3 should have been agreed by your teacher when you handed in your proposal form, and I've got a few videos on how to come up with titles and hypotheses if you're at an earlier stage where you're planning your NEA. So definitely check those out if you're at that stage. You then also need to include the justification of your hypotheses, and this is when you have to write about geographical literature and academic writing, and I'm going to talk through that in detail in the next section of this video. That's the bit students normally find a bit tricky, but I'm going to make it super clear for you. And then you need to talk about your location. So you need to introduce your study area, describe the location and the scale of your fieldwork. You need to include maps at an appropriate scale, and you can download maps from ArcGIS. Just to add, you do not need a large kind of background research history of your local area. You don't need to include demographic data. You don't need to include photos. There's one model answer online where there is a kind of bit of a history about the area, but the mark scheme clearly focuses on you justifying your hypotheses, linking to academic writing. It doesn't ask you to give a study background kind of your area. You obviously need to talk about your location and why you're studying there and why it's appropriate for your investigation. But you don't need a big history on that. Okay, let's now talk about writing your literature review or justifying your hypotheses. Now, a literature review is where you show that you've done your research. It's not a list of everything that you've read. It's a summary of the most relevant theories, studies, and academic ideas linked to your investigation. This is where students sometimes get a bit confused. So when you're at university, if you're studying a topic or you're doing your dissertation, you often have to review literature. So basically what that means is what have people investigated in the same area that you're interested in studying. Normally literature reviews can be pages long, but in the context of your NEA, we are focusing on what literature has occurred in the sphere of geography linking to what you're interested in, and how does that link to your hypotheses? So how does that either help you predict your hypotheses, what might happen? How does it help you understand your key terms and your words in your hypotheses? Or has it been investigated in another place and you can use the results of that study to help compare to the results of your own study? That's like a comparative study. Now, hopefully you might already have one academic article that underpins your investigation. If you don't, it might be useful to watch my video that I did the other day. That video talks about how you can use literature to help form your hypotheses, and it's really helpful in making an independent investigation that's relevant and linked to theory. Overall, in your introduction, you want to include at least 3, but probably to 5, high quality sources, ideally from academic articles, textbooks, or potentially government reports. This is not a time when you're using just news articles of the area. You're really focusing on what does the geography say about your topic area, and then why is that relevant to your study area. So in justifying each hypothesis, this is what you need to include. You need to define any key terms or concepts. So do you mention sense of place, well-being, regeneration, gentrification, sand dune succession, any kind of key physical terms? You need to define them. Next, you want to compare and discuss literature. You want to think about what has been said by other academics or the textbook in the subject area that you're interested in researching. You want to make sure you're not just name dropping studies, but you're actually thinking critically about what they're saying. This might be a really good place to include models or diagrams, particularly of physical geography. For example, models or diagrams of sand dune successions if you're interested in how sand dunes change. There also might be models and diagrams linking to human geography, particularly to show links between key concepts. You want to think about what the academic articles are saying about your topic area. Are they in agreement? Do they disagree? How do they relate to each other? Do they help to raise a question that you want to answer in your NEA? And this is where it becomes really important. You need to link those academic articles to your research question, and this is what we mean by justifying your hypotheses. So how does that academic research help you to understand your hypotheses and therefore your research questions? You might want to here link it a bit more to your place location. So say you're investigating regeneration, you've looked at some literature based on regeneration and the impact of it, say on local communities or maybe even causing conflict. You then need to link that back to your sub-question and why it's relevant for your place study. And then finally, another thing you can do is think about the wider geographical context. So here you might be thinking about how does your investigation add to existing research? Now, obviously, your A-level students, people are constantly thinking about this in terms of dissertation and PhDs about what their work is doing in terms of adding to the field of geography. But even though it's small scale, I think your projects are really valuable, particularly when looking at human and physical processes in really small scale local places. So I would just say that your project is really valuable to research because you're investigating this in a small area to understand the following processes. And here are my top tips for academic writing. 1, keep it concise. Your introduction and your literature review should be about 800 to 1,000 words. Your total NEA is about 4,000 words, 3,000 to 4,000 words. And although you can go over that, I don't recommend going too far over. I tell my students I'm not going to really mark anything over 6,000 because you definitely don't need to be writing more than that to achieve top marks. The most amount of marks come in your analysis and actually your conclusions and evaluations. So you need to make sure you're leaving enough space and word count for those future parts of your project. Next, don't forget to use clear subheadings. Clearly put down introduction, hypotheses, justification of hypotheses, put them in bold. You can underline them if you want, but make sure they are a different size to your main text. My next top tip is to be formal but clear and using an academic tone. You want the examiner to understand your points clearly and you don't want to overcomplicate things. So just make sure you can understand it clearly. A good way of knowing if you've written clearly is to get a parent or a friend who doesn't study geography, ask them to read it and ask them if they understand it. If they do understand it, you've probably written it clear enough, which is great. Next, you want to make sure you're writing in the third person. Now, double check with your teachers about this because some teachers don't mind, and in some ways you can write in the first person. It's actually kind of changed in terms of academia, where some reports it's fine to write in the first person. The first person means like I will investigate. The third person is more about the report. So this investigation explores, the study focuses on. So you're not writing I did this. The main thing with this is just to make sure you're consistent throughout. It makes your project really neat and sophisticated. So pick which one you're going to do and follow that all the way through. And then my final top tip is to cite your sources using the Harvard referencing system. This means that you write the academic's name or the textbook, author's name, and a bracket of the date, and then you include all your sources in your bibliography at the end of your report. You can use footnotes. Again, check with your teachers which ones they prefer. I normally suggest doing the Harvard referencing and then you don't have to worry about footnotes at the end and you can just include it in your bibliography. It's really important for plagiarism that you make sure you reference everything you have used to help you write your introduction and kind of using the sources throughout your project. And you must make sure that everything is in your bibliography at the end. Otherwise, it would be plagiarism because you're using somebody else's work without referencing it. Okay, so now let's have a look at where I've written a worked example of my justification of my hypotheses. Okay, so let's look at my worked example. First of all, I'm just going to show you the structure of it. So here I've got my title, nice and bold, my subheadings. So how does proximity to green space in Peckham Ride Park impact activity and well-being of local residents? Under my title, I have my link to the specification. It's really important here that you put an appropriate comment. So here we can see I've got the spec 3.2.2. That's the part of changing places. My title links to the nature and importance of place and the concept of place and the importance of place in human life and experience. So I've really specifically defined which part of the spec it is, and then I've said how my study links to the spec. This is important, particularly for the top level marks. The study will consider how features of place, especially the natural environment of green urban spaces, impact quality of life and well-being. I then have my hypotheses and the sub-questions. So to answer my overall title, the following hypotheses and sub-question will be investigated. 1, 2, and 3. Nice and clear for the examiner. Then the next section is justifying each hypothesis. Now I've written a sample one for hypothesis 2, which I'll talk to you about. I haven't included justifications for all of them, but you would include a paragraph under your first hypothesis, paragraph under your second one to justify the hypotheses, and then you'd have your third one. And then finally, I have the location. This investigation is based in and the surrounding roads to Peckham Ride Park. Peckham Ride Park is located in the London Borough of Southwark. The area is appropriate for the investigation due to its combination of green space and urban infrastructure, alongside a diverse population and socio-economic variation. Figures 1 and 2 show the study area. So next I have maps that show my study area. So here, and I've clearly labelled them figure 1 and figure 2, an appropriate map and at an appropriate scale. I have got my scale down here and a north arrow. Now ArcGIS can put these on automatically when you print them. You print them as a PNG. I'll show you how to do that with my ArcGIS videos. And then I've got a map. The same box is of the map above, but this is it within the location of London. So that's briefly what it looks like. You can see I have not got a large historical background. And as I mentioned, this one, when completed, it would be probably about 800 words. Let's have a look now at justifying my second hypothesis. So my second hypothesis is proximity to green space is positively associated with higher levels of well-being. So I want to do the following: defining key terms. So which key terms in my hypotheses do I need to define? I need to define at least well-being. I could potentially define differences in terms of green spaces. I then also want to use literature. So I want to think about what has been said in geography, what has been researched before, using this literature to explain why green space impacts well-being. If possible, I want to link to comparative studies, because then I can use this later on in my report. I can compare my results to their results to see if they match or to see if they're similar. And then I want to make sure I'm linking the literature to my study and my hypotheses. And then I might want to link to the wider geography. So why is my investigation important for the geography community? So I have defined well-being using the geography textbook. Not enough students in A-level geography just refer to the textbook. It's a really good way of using an unbiased academic source. There's a glossary at the back. It says when well-being is talked about in other pages. So you can see the pages and you can read the key concepts around it. So I always recommend for key terms, start with the book as your first definition. So here I've defined what well-being is. And then I've said, why is it important for place? Because remember, I'm talking about well-being and how that is impacted by proximity to places or green spaces. So well-being can be defined as the state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy, Skinner et al., 2016. That's how I reference. This is Harvard referencing, where you put the name. Et al. Simply means there's many authors. You just put the first one down, you put the date. This then will be put in my bibliography, and I'll reference the book to make sure I'm not plagiarizing or copying or not referencing any work which is important to acknowledge. Next, I'm starting to explain how place might impact well-being, and this is kind of using the information I've understood from the textbook. Place plays an important role in shaping individual well-being, as a strong sense of belonging and connection to one's surroundings can enhance both happiness and mental health. Skinner et al. Also highlighted that the environment in which a person lives can significantly influence their health, mortality, and overall well-being. Next, I want to go on. So I've kind of defined my key terms. I really want to think about, how does green space impact well-being? Now, my first overarching literature, which I found when I was making my hypotheses, again, I have a video on this, it's really, really good to watch, was this article. The role of perceived public and private green space in subjective health and well-being during and after the first peak of the COVID-19 outbreak. Found this article when I was looking for articles to inspire my hypotheses. And this one was really great because it talked about a few things to do with public and private space. It also talked about how people who live 5 minutes walking distance have a different level of kind of well-being compared to people who live over 10-minute walking distance from green spaces. These are the results which kind of shown here. As you'll see, academic articles are quite long, they're quite complicated. So what I recommend you doing is looking at the abstract, seeing if it's relevant, reading the first paragraph, seeing if they define any key terms. If it is relevant, I recommend printing it out. I always get my students to print out the academic articles, highlight the key parts, get an understanding of what it's saying, and then you can use that to write your introduction and your literature review. Remember, you want to be talking about what the literature is saying. You're not just simply lifting quotes. You need to be critically engaging with your literature. You'll actually see here when we look at it, this is actually their literature review before they conducted their research. Every time you can see different names of people, they're literally reviewing the literature on green space and wellbeing. So that actually might give you some more articles as well. There was another article which was really useful, Local Green Spaces and Mental Health, which is the first one I'm actually going to reference. This was a podcast, again, based on an academic article. I think I just found this by typing into Google green spaces and mental health or wellbeing. And it was a really useful one for my report. So here I'm going on to my literature. So Geary et al. 2023. This is the one I just recently spoke about. They investigated whether living in greener areas or close to green and blue spaces, parks, lakes or beaches was associated with better mental health across 2 million people in Wales. So I'm starting to talk about the literature. I really like including when I'm writing the literature where it was located and the scale of it, because my project is based in London and therefore the access to green space is very different than maybe the Welsh population. There's a lot more national parks that are closer, there's a lot more beaches. So later you can start to critique how your investigation is similar or dissimilar to the literature. So they found that green and blue spaces can contribute to improved mental health. Now this does talk about mental health, a bit different from well-being, but it's useful enough to help to understand why. This is because green spaces provided opportunities for physical activity and social interaction and improved air quality. So I'm actually explaining why there might be a connection using the literature. However, they also found that socioeconomic status can impact outcomes and that individuals from lower income areas gained greater mental health benefits from increased access to green spaces. So this is something which I found interesting when I was reading it, that there was a difference and that depended on your kind of economic status. You'll see here how I haven't linked back to my own research question yet. I'm actually going to discuss another literature and then link them back all in one. Additionally, Portinger et al., which was my main literature which underpinned my research, found that access to public green space is positively associated with higher levels of subjective well-being, with people living less than 5 minutes walking distance having a higher score of subjective well-being than those living more than 10 minutes. This is all literature. They also found that both public and private green space played an important role, especially in the pandemic, and that the pandemic public green spaces were important for those without gardens. Now, I don't discuss this too much, but it might come up later, but I think what's both interesting about this article and this one, and I could maybe make a more clearer link within it if I was very interested in finding out this part, is they both said how economic status can impact access to green space and how much people benefit from it, which is just quite interesting. Therefore, this investigation focuses on how proximity to a public green space, specifically Peckham Rye Park, may support higher levels of well-being. It will investigate how far people live from Peckham Rye and whether that increases overall well-being and how often people visit the park. So I'm now linking my literature back to my own study. And then I've put why my area is maybe suitable for this. As the park is located in an urban area with a mix of income levels, this study adds to the existing geographical literature by exploring the links between green space and well-being at a local scale in an urban environment, providing insights into the value of urban green space for diverse communities. So I've actually put here how it adds to the existing geographical literature and why it might be appropriate because it's different income levels. And again, that's something which might come up when I'm researching it. You might think this is a little long, and it is quite long, maybe, for justifying your hypotheses, and you don't need to write this much. I've looked at it here and I've cut out the parts which aren't precisely directly relevant for my study. So the bit about socioeconomic status, and I've mainly just focused on how green space improves mental health and well-being. And this gives me this final paragraph, which is about 170 words. Again, we can see I've defined key terms, I've linked to literature, and then I've used that literature to link to my own study area. And if you do this 3 times, so that would come to about 500 and something words, you have your link to the specification, you have the other little parts that you have to write on your introduction, and that would give us an introduction of around 800 words. It would give you a bit more space to write a bit more if you wanted to as well, but we're really trying to stick within the word count and being really precise and clear in what we're saying, and we're rooting our ideas in geographical theory and academic writing. Okay, the final bit now, linking to the mark scheme. So the mark scheme for AQA Geography, now this is in Area 1, so introduction and your research. Strand 1, 10 marks. So the assessment criteria, there are 2 parts for this, 1A and 1B. So 1A is to define research questions which underpin your field investigations, and 1B is to research relevant sources and understand and write up the theoretical and comparative context for a research question. To get level 4, so the research question is effectively identified and is completely referenced to the specification. So have you put down your main hypotheses or aims, and have you referenced them to the specification, remember, with that suitable comment. The suitable comment is really important for having completely referenced the specification. Done, tick, top level 4. The next part for level 4, well supported by thorough use of relevant literature sources. So is your literature relevant to your area? So have you picked the appropriate literature and the background theory to your research questions? Yes. Do you have a range of different sources? That's what it links to, and are they thorough? And then are your kind of comparative context and your theoretical context, so basically, do you understand your literature? Is it well explained? And if you do that, linking and justifying your hypotheses, then you're able to get 10 marks. You'll notice that there isn't a separate part for location, but that kind of links to kind of both of them. Is your research appropriate for your location? And that is how you write the introduction. So to recap, your introduction explains what you're investigating and why. Your literature review connects your project to academic research. These sections show the examiner that you understand the theory behind your NEA, you understand the geographical concepts, and the literature that you've talked about will be used later to refer your results back to. So it's really, really important that you do this. In the next video, we're going to be talking about writing your methodology, and it's a little bit simpler than the introduction, so it'll be a bit shorter. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, and if you found this useful, please comment below.